Okay, I think we are live here. Let me make sure. I think we're good. Welcome to this special panel, Seeking Futures, which is in conjunction with the Carnegie Hall Fall of the Weimar Republic Dancing on the Precipice Festival. My name is Julian Chambliss. I will be the host of this conversation. I'm very pleased to have my colleagues, both from the Michigan State University and from the University of Illinois here as a part of this conversation. Kenitra Brooks, who's the John Leslie Endowed Chair of Literary Studies, Josh Lamb, Assistant Professor in the Department of English, and Stacey Robinson. This presentation or this discussion is actually growing from the work that I've been doing around Afrofuturism. If you haven't had a chance, please check out Afrofantastic, the transformative world of Afrofuturism, which I'm proud to say has been incorporated into NETA's Black History Month curated collection. So if you have a local PBS station that might be interested in learning more about Afrofuturism, and NETA is the way to do it this semester or this Black History Month by looking at Afrofantastic. Because Afrofuturism is at the core of a lot of the work that we're doing here at MSU, I thought it was really interesting to bring together a group of scholars to talk about the implications of thinking through the Weimar Republic. I've been very grateful to have the opportunity to participate in conversations with Tim Thilder, who's also a part of this festival, and doing groundbreaking work of adapting W.E.B. Du Bois's The Comet into a graphic novel as a part of the festival. Those conversations, of course, are available online. This conversation is really growing out of our collective understanding of the complicated links between futurity, modernism, and some of the debates and cultural conversations that we can trace back to the Weimar Republic. Each one of us is going to talk a little bit about that, and then we'll go into a sort of joint conversation where we think through the implications of exploring these ideas. I'm going to start by talking about what I believe are important intellectual intersections that are known, in some ways, perhaps not as well known in the context of these discussions. For me, one of the reasons that this question of futurity and Black speculative practice matter in conjunction with the Weimar Republic is because for key figures that I am engaged with, like Zora Neale Hurston and like W.B. Du Bois, they have intellectual connections that lead them back to Germany. In the case of Du Bois, of course, it's well known that he studied in Germany in the late 19th century. And his short story, The Comet, is a foundational text of early Afrofuturist work. Perhaps equally known, but perhaps not necessarily contextualized the same way, Zora Neale Hurston studied anthropology under Franz Boas, and Boas's position as a person advocating for a cultural understanding and in opposition to the scientific racism of the early 20th century provided a fertile intellectual ground that drove Hurston in exploration of her work of Black people. In many ways, Hurston is, I often advocate, an Afrofuturist who's gone unnoticed and underappreciated. And one of the things I'm really pleased by in recent years is how many people have turned to think about Hurston as an Afrofuturist, recognizing both her creative work and work represent the kind of Black speculative practice that intervenes and helps to expand the definition of Blackness. This is so much at the core of how we think about Afrofuturism. That idea that you have two people, two intellectuals who are corresponding and producing work that rely both on the critical and the creative is really at the core of the ways I think Afrofuturist practice affects both the past and the contemporary landscape. For me, if we're thinking seriously about the 20th century, we have to recognize that Black cultural production, as many Afrofuturists talk about, is an important tool to upending and interrupting the ideas associated with scientific racism, and offering tools of liberation and transformation for people of color, not just simply in the United States, but around the world. And one of the things that the scholars that I'm pointing to here both share is a recognition of a broader diaspora connected to Blackness that's more complex, nuanced, and uplifting than what the white society would have suggested at the time. And I would think even in our contemporary period, they offer important points of contestation and inspiration that we need to engage with continuously. So with those opening statements, I hope to shed light on the ways that our conversation are going to expand what's being offered in the Fall of the Weimar Republic Festival, and call attention to the many ways that we can accentuate the possibility of learning about Black speculative practice. So with that, I'll turn over to my colleague, Dr. Kenitra Brooks.
Thank you. I would like to begin by thanking the Carnegie Foundation for their continued interest in my work and our work as a whole. I would also like to thank Dr. Chambliss for inviting me to speak this evening. And I would like to thank in advance my fellow panel members for the conversation, the amazing conversation I know that we will have. I want to speak in the realm of Black cultural expression, and particularly begin to interrogate the Weimar Republic's sort of idealized idea of themselves as a colorblind society, and as having more progressive ideas with regards to race, particularly when juxtaposed against the United States of America. Next slide. And I want to bring in and center my discussion on Josephine Baker, who was born in St. Louis in the early 20th century. And she is a dancer that was known to be one of the most famous women in Europe in the 1920s during the time of the Weimar Republic. She is mostly associated with her success in Paris, but the lesser known is that she had a triumph in Berlin. She conquered Berlin just as much as she conquered Paris. And the composer Rudolf Nelson placed his Berlin theater at her disposal. And she came to fore in the city as Black Venus when she performed the Danse Sauvage in 1926 as a part of La Revue Negre. She said specifically, "Berlin feels great, a pure triumph. In no other city have I received so many letters, so many flowers and gifts." And she also brought the Charleston to Germany, triggering a dance craze. She became a sort of paparazzi of the time. Everyone knew she was a celebrity. Everyone knew what she was wearing, what she was doing. And with this, performers such as Josephine Baker began to problematize the German ideas of racial progressiveness through her performance of the primitive. And the primitive and this encounter with the primitive began what Meg Henderson calls as an idealized version of colonialism. And it's this sort of domesticated and fantastical encounter with the native, as Josephine Baker would embody her. Next slide. So there's the idea that with this encounter with the native, they are reinscribing a specularized colonial narrative, one that was necessarily heavily racialized, sexualized, and genderized. This drama staged the encounter of the colonizer and the colonized, spectator and spectacle, the white gaze coded as male, and the Black body coded as female. Berlin's fascination with the primitive reveals the falsity of the paternalism toward African Americans that would often be shared in intellectual conversations, right? So while they were having this sort of intersection of the idea of Bildung or development with intellectuals such as Du Bois, with intellectuals such as Hurston, they were simultaneously being titillated by performances of women such as Josephine Baker as this sexualized and temptress in this primitive and native clothing. We have the words of, next slide, please, Yvonne Gold, who says Negroes dance with their senses, while white Europeans can only dance with their minds. They dance with their legs, breasts, and bellies. One can only envy them, for this is life, sun, primeval forests, the singing of birds, and the roar of a leopard, earth. They never dance naked, and yet, how naked is the dance? They have put on clothes only to show that clothes do not exist for them. And so I would like to, question, how does Josephine in her dance mitigate this idea of Black horror, which is this fear and desire, this combination of the both that occurs with Germany's encounter with the primitive. Next slide. And I'd like us to begin to consider and discuss how African Americans symbolize the primitive with the color of their skin, while also juxtaposing that against their Americanness, which marks them as partially assimilated or assimilable into the idea of European civilization. And finally, I would like to end with the idea of the look atness of the Black female body by Germans, both during the Weimar Republic and as we move into more contemporary ideas and performances of the primitive. We see where Josephine Baker has influenced Diana Ross, who then continues to influence the line of Beyonce. This idea of the primitive remains alive today, and I think it's a concept that we can continue to return to. Thank you.
Thanks. Now, Stacey Robinson, professor, artist, DJ.
All right. Thank you all for having me. I think in continuation of that conversation, it's important to think about and look at what our vision of the future looks like. So as we come out of these European aesthetics that have classified us as lesser than, as primitive, it is extremely important that we think about what our Black liberated futures look like. And that is what I am dedicated to in my aesthetic. So with that, I am giving you a little bit about myself. I am a graphic designer. I'm an illustrator. I'm a comic artist, exhibition artist, and as Julian said, a burgeoning DJ. This piece here is an example of my aesthetic that is inspired by West African aesthetics. And this imagines this piece is called Kwanzaa as a Blood River Future. And it thinks about what our future looks like as a form of government, as Black liberation and as Black freedom, using our thinking, our philosophies, our theories, our practices as a system of government. This is Kwanzaa as a Blood River Future. Next slide, please. So I look at three different things. I look at the idea of Sankofa, which is a West African concept, meaning to go back and get it, a Ghanaian concept. That means to go back and get our past as we are venturing and traveling into the future. I'm also looking at the idea of sovereignty. A colonial power will only recognize national power. So until Black people can define ourselves as a nation, we will not be able to barter in the ways in which national powers are able to barter for equity and freedom globally. We will always rely on a colonial government ethically and morally, but in no way can we hold them accountable in a way that we can force them to give us justice. And then I look at what our belief system is in reference to time and space. So I'm studying a lot of physics right now and looking at African concepts around time and space. Next slide, please. And I do all of this in thinking about our Black liberated government, what that looks like, defining ourselves, like I said, through our systems. So three of the systems in which I look at are the 12 jewels by the 5% nations of gods and earths, which these 12 jewels are a system. In order to get love, peace, and happiness in our communities, we must first begin with knowledge, wisdom, and understanding. The 5 primary elements of hip hop. And I'm sorry, there is, I believe that my mic is picking up on everyone else. So everyone else. All right, thank you very much. All right, so the 5 primary elements of hip hop and the 7 principles of Kwanzaa. These are other systems I'm looking at in order for us to think about how can we self-govern ourselves. All right, next slide, please. So with this, I do work in the traditions, and I am looking at some manifestos, one being Du Bois's Criteria of Negro Art, the Black Panther Party 10-point program, and the Political Artist Manifesto of Emory Douglas. And if you can read those bolded points, I'll give you a moment to read those bolded points. I will, I'm not going to read all of this, but you can read this for yourself. And I'm not expecting you to read all of this. If you want to see more, you can look at my website, staceyarobinson.com. But these are some points, some manifestos that we can use to help govern ourselves. I think this is important to build our own aesthetics and theories as we are building out our own Black liberated futures. I think it looks like a particular thing. All right, next slide, please. All right, so with that, this is what my theory, my philosophy is looking at. It is based on West African belief systems, the Bukongo cosmogram, and even the hero's journey. And even this is what my theory looks like. If you look at the image on the left, the Black Star Cosmosgram. Black Star is my art alias, so, and this is my Cosmosgram. This is what my belief system looks like as a theory, as a visualization. And with the work that I'm making now, I'm also developing a scientific method, which is the bottom circular image, to qualify and quantify these practices. Next slide, please. All right, so there are some books that I'm looking at and studying to think about what is the foundation of how I'm looking at this right now. Bettina L. Love's book, We Want to Do More Than Survive, and even her current book, Punished for Dreaming, and Freedom Dreams by Robin D.G. Kelly, and of course, W.E.B. Du Bois's of visualizations, the sociological studies, looking at the status of Black people, Black America. And next slide, please. So I do this, as I said earlier, through comic books and exhibitions and collaborative work and surreal aesthetics that are very open to interpretation, but are layered in heavy politics. And then Black themed, Black liberation graphic design aesthetics. Next slide, please. And as a graphic designer, I have tried my best to position myself to brand the Afrofuture. There are a number of us doing this, but I've been very fortunate to work with some amazing colleagues to help provide artistic works to their covers, to give a particular thinking and a particular aesthetic to Black liberated futures in the books that we are writing. This is a few of them. All right, next slide, please. And the collaborations in which, collaboration is a very, very important part of my practice. I work a lot with John Jennings and my partner, my collaborative partner, Kamal Grantham. And with all of this that we do, this artwork that we make, we also spin beats. What does our Black liberated space sound like? And we collaborate with a number of people in order to create multimedia sound and visual aesthetics that are what I would like to call temporary utopian spaces. I did not coin that term, but I do like to think about that in reference to the work. And everything that we do is free and open to the public. And I will leave that there with that. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Stacey.
Let me close out on this. This is my Afrofuturist. I'm very proud of this. I forgot about this slide.
Close out. I'm sorry.
Right.
Yeah. We can always come back to you later.
All right. Well, I got to talk about that Afrofuturism class for sure. Absolutely.
Yeah. Josh.
Yeah, I want to hear about that. Thank you all. I'm really excited to talk further. Um, I want to talk a little bit just about like how and why the Weimar Republic became a point of interest with a number of African American modernists who are associated with the New Negro movement or the Harlem Renaissance. So let's go to the first slide. Um, so yeah, the New Negro movement is like this explosion of Black literature, art, and culture in Harlem and around Harlem in the 1920s in the US. And it's emphasizing aesthetic innovation as well as racial uplift, and especially the use of literary and artistic innovation to kind of practice racial uplift. Next slide. It's worth noting, of course, that several of the figures who were like canonized as New Negro writers in a way are also now seen as forebears of Afrofuturism. So Hurston, Du Bois, we heard of them, Jean Toomer. Next slide. Thank you. I also wanted to mention that, you know, the Harlem Renaissance is one name for this, but it was obviously from the beginning exceeding the bounds of Harlem. First of all, a lot of the writers and artists were not from New York or Harlem. They came from Chicago, DC, Detroit, Jamaica, Puerto Rico. And they also traveled internationally, like many other kind of like, you know, white American expats did, like Hemingway, Stein. They're also traveling to these big European centers, London, Paris, Berlin. And that tells us right away that this was not just a localized movement or a national movement, but was international and cosmopolitan. Next slide, please. But Germany did hold kind of a special interest for a number of writers. One of those already mentioned was Du Bois, who was educated there. But a lesser known kind of aspect of his life was that in 1936, about 3 years after the fall of the Weimar Republic and its transformation into Hitler's Third Reich, Du Bois visited again for like 5 months and like traveled extensively throughout Germany and was kind of reporting back to the US in a Black newspaper called the Pittsburgh Courier, and he was kind of reporting about what he saw. And one reason I think that he and many other Black writers and intellectuals were really fascinated by Germany and other European nations was that they had this kind of liberal cosmopolitanism, or else a kind of tolerance on some level, a social tolerance for Black folks that, you know, was not here in the US. So there's a stark contrast with Jim Crow. At the same time, Du Bois is writing about not experiencing a single instance of racial prejudice during his 5 months there, no discrimination, but he's also writing very insightfully and forcefully about the complexities of the rise of anti-Semitism and fascism, even while he's in Germany, and then even more so once he leaves, and then he starts talking about censorship. So there's a tension there between cosmopolitanism and the kind of, you know, racism and colonialism. I'm also thinking about kind of shared and reappropriated aesthetic traditions. Du Bois, of course, was a lover of German literature and culture, and so he incorporates like Schiller and Goethe and Wagner into the souls of Black folk right alongside Black spirituals. Alain Locke, in his famous 1925 anthology, The New Negro, also is collecting many of the main figures and players in this movement, but he's also including visual art by German artists. Next slide, please. So we've got work by Aaron Douglas, one of the best known African-American artists of this era. We've also got, in the same book, art and design by Winold Reiss, who's a German artist and who tutored Douglas. Next slide, please. One other weird example that I just wanted to mention is that there's also a single image by a different, lesser known German artist named Walter von Ruckteschell. I hope I'm saying that right. And there's an image of his that's included in the New Negro, which I think is interesting because von Ruckteschell was actually, he became an artist by drawing portraits of African subjects when he was in Africa, in East Africa, as part of like a German colonial military occupation. And he even, you know, during World War I, he fights for the colonial forces. After that, he's a lifelong apologist for the myth of like a benign colonialism. So it's very strange to see him included as an artist in the New Negro. But it's also interesting to notice how like Locke, the editor, makes these little changes. So you can see the juxtaposition here. The axis is tilted slightly to present like a stronger image. And rather than a portrait of a single individual subject, Hassan Bilal, Locke gives it a new title, Young Africa. And then later he changes it to Young Negro. In both instances, making it kind of a forward-facing representation of a larger group instead. So I think this brings up questions about the complexities of shared literary traditions and the possibility of strategic appropriations. Next slide, please. The last thing I'll mention that I think kind of helps to explain some of the interest that Germany held for Black American writers and thinkers was the kind of political scenario. And there's one detail I'll just focus on, which is called the Black Horror on the Rhine. And it's basically this moment when France was militarily occupying the Rhine and using Black Senegalese soldiers to do so. And it kind of created a moral panic. We might call it like a race hysteria in Germany. Lots of Germans thought this was a provocation. It upset all of the kind of civilizational hierarchies. And so there's this kind of outburst of racist propaganda. Claude McKay, a poet, novelist, and also Locke both traveled to Berlin and like met there. They're in 1923. They wrote about this phenomena and they're studying it. And I think they're doing that because they saw Germany at this moment as one scholar puts it, a barometer of international race relations. So they're looking at it both as kind of like a warning because they're seeing this rise of all too familiar racist propaganda. But they're also experiencing what I was just talking about, this liberal kind of cosmopolitanism or this personal acceptance of social freedoms. So there's this really interesting tension there. And if we think of Germany at this time as a barometer of international race relations, and we're thinking about futurity, you think about where Germany was going in the 1930s and 40s. That's a very grim prospect. But at the same time, I think we have to remember too that was also a conflict that was involving a huge kind of coalition of different international anti-colonial forces. And that's part of what Locke and McKay and Du Bois are also all interested in. So those are some of the tensions that I'm interested in continuing to think about that still have relevance today, I think. Thanks.
Thanks, Josh. I want to bring us all together now to think through some of the ground that we've outlined in our opening statements. In particular, my first question for all of you, given the work that you've done, what are the ways that you might think of contemporary Afrofuturism offering important sort of interventions? I think all have alluded to this, but I want to open the floor for a kind of fruitful conversation about the potentialities here in terms of using Afrofuturism to rethink these narratives that we associate with the Weimar Republic and that longer sort of implication in terms of the modern 20th century. So I open the floor to whoever wants to say the first thing. I'm gonna call on somebody if somebody talks about them.
All right, Kenitra, you got it. You unmuted.
I did unmute. So I think Afrofuturism provides us the ability to contextualize to the ways in which we remix, revise larger or mainstream culture and ideas about us and bring that and manifest that into our Black cultural expression. But I would also say the ways in which we create ourselves and form our sense of ourselves, and having that sort of core sense of African Americanness, Afro diasporicness, even Africanness, that sort of girds us against the sort of the barrage of anti-Black ideas, anti-Black thinking. It's in the ways in which we have our own self-actualization and self-determination.
Stacey, what were you going to say?
I was going to actually reference that slide that that didn't get shown earlier, but I can talk about it. It's fine. I think it's important for us to, if we're thinking about Afrofuturism, it's important for us to define what that is. How do we define what our liberation and our freedom? So how do we free ourselves? And then how do we maintain our freedom? That's our liberation and our nationhood, right? Our liberation and our freedom. And how do we define ourselves as a nation? And I think Afrofuturism needs to address these particular things. So with that, I devised 10 tenets that I use to frame that, at least for me. Not to say that that frames Afrofuturism for everyone. I think Afrofuturism is different for everyone. For example, if you are hungry, your family is hungry, and your family is poor, your Afrofuturists are securing food for the night, right? Or if you are cold and lack clothing, your Afrofuturism is securing clothing, right? But if you are in some other privileged places, you may be able to think about some more extensive matters. And those tenets are the tenets that they're on my website. You can definitely check them out. But they're what I am framing in my Afrofuturism illustration class for my predominantly, whenever I'm teaching these classes, they're predominantly white and Asian students. But this semester, I have Asian and Black students, and they're dedicated to drawing Black futures and illustrating Black futures and thinking about what that looks like. So I think these are ways in which that we can begin to address or redirect attention away from what has been built around imagining what Blackness is outside of how we have defined it.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. Josh, is there anything you want to add to that narrative?
Maybe things to emphasize rather than add. I mean, I think those are both excellent answers. Kanitra was talking about contextualizing and remixing, and I'm also thinking about the kind of long tradition of strategic reappropriations and recontextualizing. So I think that remains a really compelling aesthetic and political technique that we still see in Afrofuturism. Maybe one other thing I'm thinking about is the kind of affordances of the concept of Afrofuturism when we return to like a historical period and we try and kind of envision what kinds of futures were being imagined, even if it's 100 years ago. So I'm also very interested in even what that can do in terms of kind of like revising and expanding our view of certain historical moments, because we can start to kind of think about that not as a present that's done, but as a kind of a moment when people were like very actively like looking to the future and imagining and creating. Yeah.
Well, I appreciate that. Go ahead, Kenitra. I'm sorry.
No, I just wanted to say, I think we're all sort of speaking around the concept of time. And, going back to what Stacy had with the bird, the Sankofa bird, of standing in the present, looking back with your feet face toward the future, and this sort of conflation and compression of time that allows the past, present, and future to exist at the very same time. And that allows us to use the presentness of the Weimar Republic to have a very a conversation that spans and that we can take into the future. And I just want to bring all those points together.
Well, I'm glad you said that, because my next question is very much about the reality of this festival from my perspective. Obviously, as I've probably alluded to each of you as we were putting the panel together, I was asking you to join me. I think one of the things about this festival that really resonates with our contemporary landscape is that many of the forces that define the Weimar Republic, I think, are actually some of the same forces that are at the core of our contemporary landscape, right? And so as the name of the festival implies, it failed, right? It's the fall of. And so therefore, I don't want to be an alarmist here, but what can we learn from the decline of this seemingly artistically and culturally innovative moment? I think there are important questions offered by this moment that resonate in a very powerful way with many of the debates that I think we all think about in the context of our own work. And I'd love for us to sort of consider, what is one thing that fall of the Weimar Republic period sort of resonates with you in consideration of contemporary cultural dynamics.
I think when we think about the fall of Weimar Republic, we must think about what replaced it, right? And we are in a time where in every corner of our culture, we are discussing democracy and what democracy looks like. And I think it's important to know history and to know how, and I think, and you just spoke to this, right? You spoke like there's a similitude to 100 years ago, right? We are in a very similar place. And that is by design. I'm a graphic designer, so I look at systems of design. And the designs that we could possibly enter into again in America that we could duplicate from Germany would be intentional, right? We have to understand that the changes that we are seeing, the every effort of diversity, equity, and inclusion is being challenged on a national level, right? And we are being challenged in that in our institutions as well, having to not even address that, being challenged to not even address that, right? This rise of fascism is a very real thing, and I believe we have to take a very strategized approach to how we're going to think about dismantling this very powerful design. And I'll leave it there for now.
I would also say that this is a time speaking specifically of Black folks, that we remember who we are, and that Blackness cannot be killed, and that we have survived, that we have thrived, and that we have systems in place, and that we learn from the past. Again, the past is present, and we have these systems have not killed us, even though this killed some of us, but it hasn't killed us as a whole. These systems have birthed new ideas, have given us new ways and new strategies. And we are always a people that are steps ahead. We see what's coming. We know it's coming. And that it may not happen next year, but it'll happen 10 years from now. And that we remember our ancestors, remember what they survived, remember they survived worse. And they still gave us life. They gave us hope. They gave us a lot of love. And that there will be difficulties, not saying there will not be any sufferings, but in the end, we will be okay.
Well, I appreciate both what Stacey and what you just said, Kenitra. I think for a large swath of people, one of the things that makes these considerations of Black speculative practice or Afrofuturism or Black imaginary or whatever terms we want to employ, what gives it so much traction right now is exactly the thing that Kenitra just alluded to, that there's a wealth of knowledge represented by previous generations, resistance, their imagining towards a liberated future. And I'm always mindful that people ask, well, what's a thing that I can do? Like what can I pull from this past that you're talking about when you talk about Afrofuturism? I would say from my own perspective, thinking about the intersections between someone like a Hurston and Du Bois in the context of their work and their intellectual practice. One of the things that's very intriguing for me is that they both sort of relied on a kind of systemic attack or a systemic resistance in their work, right? I often point out to my students that if you think about both Du Bois and Hurston, they employ both critical and artistic practices because those things got everybody, right? Like even if you were having in the intellectual space, they produced work that was very defining, groundbreaking, innovative, but he would also produce this cultural work, I think, as a vehicle to make the intellectual work that much more impactful as a delivery system at some level to these important transformative practices. If you think about the idea that we're on a pathway that mimics many of the sort of cultural contours of Weimar, what are practices that people can employ that would be interventions or modes of resistance? What does that look like for the everyday person? Again, I am mindful that not everyone's sitting around and have the luxury of the sort of intellectual conversation. They're looking for, is there a thing that I can do? Is there a way that I can support? And I look at the past and see, well, yes, there were ways that people worked in collective activism, worked through certain kinds of organizations, and did other things. What are some of the things from your perspective, from all your perspectives, that may be a similar kind of space of activism and action?
I'll go first here. And I was just talking with my colleagues, Stephanie Tolliver, yesterday, and we were talking about Black doctoral students who have a difficult time sometimes using the same methods that Du Bois and Hurston used in studying and utilizing Black ethnographic studies and having that work validated by white professors, right? So one of the things, like, she was really on me about, she was like, Stacey, you have development methodologies, but you don't have a book out that we can cite. And I was like, I was like, I see you yelling at me through that beautiful smile. Right. And I thought it was very important. And she spoke about that. She's like, I have all of these students, and many of the Black ones are struggling with this thing because white professors will not acknowledge the traditions of their grandmother that was passed down to them. Right. Kenitra talks about that a lot, right? All right, that's enough. I'm not gonna give you any more love and support, shout outs in that, right? That's my sister, I appreciate it. Right? She talks about that a lot. Another thing that we could do locally, because most of us are not coming from those academic circles, is that we can join organizations of like-minded interest. So we don't have to know it all. And I think that sometimes we look at a problem as so large and so complex, and we're like, I don't know where to begin in dismantling this broad system. You don't have to know it all. You know one piece of something, right? Maybe you're whatever that is, whatever you can contribute your one contribution to the organization of other like-minded people, and you build that system to solve that particular problem together as a unit. That is one thing that we can do. So there's the academic thing that we can do and documenting our Black methodologies that other people can utilize. But then there's also the local work that we can do in joining with allied resources. All right, with that, I'm complete. Thank you.
I do want to respond to that because I do think the idea of the liberated archive or the community archive is something that is sort of near and dear to my heart, in part because of digital humanities and the efforts to sort of document community and create archives, and using that digital infrastructure to do the thing like taking the words and deeds of the community and getting them into the archive in a way that can be cited, right? Like creating oral history as and giving a DOI, which is a digital object identifier, right? Which means you can cite it, right? And so that's a old practice in a way, because that stretches back to the revolutions of oral history practice or the revolution of cultural studies in the late 60s and 70s. But in a digital humanities perspective, what it's doing in contemporary landscape, you can see it in projects like the Color Convention Project, where they're bringing the digital record of Black people's activism from all the way to the beginning of the American experience and making it accessible and building learning tools and teaching tools and creating spaces where communities can contribute. And that really does become the founding blocks of a lot of more nuanced conversations that drive academic discourse. And so there's ways that, if your family has something and it's important to the history of your community, or you have photographs or are important to the evolution of your family or your community, you don't have to give those things to the library, but you can reach out to the library. Hey, I'll let you digitize them and I'll tell you what they are. And a lot of libraries would be very interested in, like, oh yeah, actually digitization, or reach out to professors or your local history societies and be like, yeah, I want to participate in a project to document my community. And you'd be surprised how many organizations that are really close to you would be interested in participating in that. And what that does is that you create that institutional repository that allows your story, the story of your community, the story of your family, story of your aunt, to be enshrined in an institutional way. And then that becomes the basis for those doctoral students to be able to, oh, okay, this has been curated. This has this veneer of academic affirmation to it. I can use it, right? I don't have to just simply be afraid that someone's not gonna accept it. I say all that just to point out, no one ever has a problem with old white people use their family stories, by the way. Like it never comes up, right? Like, I want to use my family papers in a dissertation. I've never heard of any person say no to white people when they say that. I just want to point that out. Like, it's only Black people. It's only Black people. Maybe I'm wrong. Send your hateful mail to Carnegie Hall, though, if that happens. So I'm gonna stop talking and let other people speak. But I just wanted to throw that out there because I was really engaged by what Stacey had to say.
Or you can just say screw it and cite your dreams of your grandmother the way I do. And just come to me as a professor, use my name and say, like Dr. Brooks said, it was cool. I can do it. I like to talk about, speaking about this stuff reminds me of Bell Hooks' Home Place. And remembering the importance of home and creating home. Often it's a very gendered place of, Black women, but I think we can also learn greatly from Black queer folks, trans folks, in creating family in very, very specific ways that are there to strengthen the political work that needs to be done. So looking at home place in terms of Bell Hooks talks about it as a place where Black folks can be subjective and where we can argue back and forth. We can have disagreement, but in love. Also as a place of, as someone who looks at the work of my maternal ancestors and what they do. My folks weren't out on the streets marching, but when you came home, they made sure you had a meal, right? So this idea of folks have different jobs in the movement and in the community and in those sorts of things. Who's going to grow our food? Who's going to can you raise chickens? Can you process a chicken? Can you kill a hog? You know, the practicalities of making sure we are not only defended and not only that we are in the streets, but also that we have a place of safety and love to come back to, that we can re-energize ourselves, that we can have good food and good company and good love, and also a place, a safe place for our children and the next generations, as well as a safe place for our elderly, right? Every generation is involved. Everyone has a job and something to do, but also everyone deserves the right to feel loved, to be fed, and to be housed. Yeah.
We're getting to the last part of our conversation, and I would love for each of you to, as I said early on, this is an opportunity for us to sort of expand on the conversation, the space created by the fall of the Weimar Republic, Dancing on the Precipice Festival. So if you had opportunity to direct people to some resources that they should read or some spaces they should explore, what would those be? And I'm going to ask everyone to sort of share, regardless of whether or not you think it's academic or not. Again, this is an opportunity for us to really expand people's horizons and engage them in the possibility of exploration and learning more from whatever perspective we can offer. So I'm going to ask Josh to start off. Like, what would you send people to read or engage with that might build on some of the ideas that they've heard here tonight?
That's a great question. Man, I mean, we've talked about so much, so I'm just trying to think a minute about like which direction to head in. So, I mean, let me say this. Like, I guess, you know, like I love reading like the history of literature and art. So like, you know, these like founding figures who are now they've been getting attention, but you know, like Hurston and Du Bois, I think like there's still so much they can teach us. So I would always suggest, you know, people go back to, you know, not just like for Du Bois, The Souls of Black Folk, but Darkwater, his autobiographies are really amazing. You know, and like because earlier we were talking about, you know, like the personal and the political and the interweaving, and I mean that's there in like all kinds of genres. It's there in his sociology and in The Souls of Black Folk and Darkwater, but it's there in his autobiographies too, where he's still like theorizing and historicizing as well as like writing memoir, and you know, so there's those folks, and although these names that I'm about to mention are not usually associated with Afrofuturism, I'm also thinking about the continual kind of widening of opportunities to bring the personal into the scholarly, or to make sure that we're fusing the personal and the creative and the artistic. So I mean, like in addition to folks we've been talking about, you know, Christina Sharp and Saidiya Hartman, like we're seeing things that are like that word scholarship become more and more personal. And I think, you know, that's validating both a kind of intersectionality and a combination of like, yeah, the personal and the political. So those are, yeah, I guess Saidiya Hartman and Christina Sharp in the contemporary, Hurston and Du Bois in the past. I'll leave it there. I'm sure we have lots of other things we could suggest.
Great, thanks a lot. Kenitra.
I think in terms of speculative futures and what we can look forward to, both good and bad, I think there are a large number of folks, particularly in young adult literature, who are doing really good work in that area. I would look at folks such as N.K. Jemisin. Niecy Shaw is doing wonderful things with her Everfair series that I'm currently reading. We have Cherie Renee Thomas on the recommended reading list. And I would also begin to look at those folks who are changing conversations. So Nikki Kendall's Hood Feminism, even in terms of referring back to Bell Hooks's work, some of her lesser known pieces, and also those things that are teaching us about different spiritual traditions, teaching us about different liberation theologies, and as Stacy's work talked about, Black gods. Having those conversations and doing that research, as well as listening to and sitting at our own kitchen tables. And I think that is the most important thing we can do, is to collect the stories of our elders, to make sure that the children are there and that they can hear our lived histories from people who are blood or near blood. Those conversations, we can read whoever in the world, but the most valuable things we can learn is to sit down with our mothers, our great aunts, our great uncles, as they're barbecuing, talk to them about their lives, as they're cooking. This is why I think the domestic arts, those spaces when people produce food for the people that they love, not just in the kitchen, but on the grill, across the gender spectrum here. But that's when we get the love and the stories and the good and the bad. We get that knowledge passed on. That is key, because our loved ones won't always be there with us, right? Take and record them on your phones. Take and record them on something you can access, so you can go back to that, not just as a place of comfort when unfortunately they pass, but also as a place of knowledge that you can pass on to the further generations of your family.
Thanks a lot. Stacy?
This is a great question about suggested reading. I'm going to go back to Bettina L. Love's books. I mentioned them earlier. Her latest book, Punished for Dreaming. And the first book, We Want to Do More Than Survive. And these are two really awesome books to help broach the subject matter of these complex issues that we're dealing with. Another resource, I'm going to say, another non-academic book that's a resource, I'm going to say pick up the political cartoonist satire of Keith Knight. Right. And because he does a really good job of helping to address the weighty subject matters around race and politics, all through really satirical humor. And these types of books they're not academic books, but they help us approach the subject matter in ways that might be more digestible. So I think those are three really awesome resources.
Right. And I will add to that for people interested in Hurston's work, Everytone's Got to Confess, I think is a particular collection that I always advocate that people check out. I also will shamelessly plug Everytone's Got to Confess, the podcast, which I did for about 5 years, that was inspired by that collection, but was more about a series of conversations of people who went to the Zora Neale Hurston Festival of the Arts and Humanities. And one of the things that inspired us to do that was the ideology of Hurston drew so many people from so many different places. It was always fascinating to see how contemporary figures imagined and were inspired by and reimagined what Hurston did, wrote, and how she lived as a template for what they wanted to do. So it's always really interesting to sort of think about the way that these past figures work as exemplars for contemporary practice. The other thing is, like Stacy, I would say comics. So if you have not read John Jennings' adaptation of Octavia Butler's work, so I would say read Kindred, and I would say read Parable of the Sower. I would also say that a lot of the comics coming out of his imprint, Megascope, are worth your time. And obviously, Milestone Comics, which is a comic book company of the 1990s that told, I think, really inclusive stories that talked about the urban environment and imagined many possible futures in a way that was inclusive and transformative, is also worth your time. So if you didn't get anything out of this, you got some really great reads for your future self to do. So I promised my colleagues that this would only run an hour, and they're hungry and tired. And I appreciate so much them willing to give their time and their insight and share that with us and you. I want to thank Carnegie Hall and praise them for their continued engagement with cultural questions that matter. This is a follow-up, in my mind, to their great festival on Afrofuturism that happened recently. So kudos to them. And if you like this conversation, I will say there will be a second Seeking Futures panel on February 22nd. At least will be recorded then, but will be available, where I speak with a number of Germanists, that is German specialists, about the Weimar Republic as a sort of kind of parallel and bookend to this discussion from scholars that are really sort of steeped in Afrofuturism and American modernism and a broader consideration of 20th century culture. So thank you so much, and good night.
Good night, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Good night. Thank you.